Jordan and Gretzky, Serena and Ruth. Remembering great ones is easy to do.
But what about the no-names who spent their whole lives long snapping footballs and catching sack flies? They're guys, remember that guy. Remember that guy, remember that guy, remember that guy, remember that guy.
They're just gonna remember some guys now.
Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has Remember That Guy, the show where we mine our memories for nuggets of nostalgia about peripheral players past and present. Hey there, folks. It's me, one of your hosts, James, and I did not plan on doing this again. I did this last year because despite definitely feeling some apprehension going into the 2023 playoffs, largely in the aftermath of that season, in the wake of the regular season at the very least, I was experiencing a pure and unbridled joy that I simply had to express in some capacity and couldn't talk about to people. I couldn't really talk about it to anyone but myself, and so I decided to let you all in on that little bifurcated mind conversation. Again, didn't think I was going to do this year because a bit's never as funny the second time, frankly. But to offer an abstract for what I'm about to say, 2024 did not inspire those same feelings, though it did inspire some strong feelings nonetheless. There was joy, to be sure. Let me get that out of the way. There were some genuinely magical moments with this most recent Orioles season. The first of which came before, trading for Corbin Burnes, having a real ace on the team. That opening weekend against the Angels, putting up 25 runs, insane. And then later on throughout the season, things like the Jackson Holiday Grand Slam when he returned, even things that might seem more negative. James McCann getting hit in the face and getting his nose broken, gushing blood, and the Orioles still managing to win that game. This was, in many, many ways, a good season. After all, this year was just the second time since the 1970s that the Orioles made the playoffs in consecutive seasons. Throughout my entire lifetime, that has only happened once more, and I'll be honest, I was too young to remember it. So that is a fact that shows how good this year was on its face. And it is just the third time in that span that they have had 3 consecutive winning seasons at any point. Those are some facts, and one might go so far as to say fun facts. They represent the positives of this year, but there are other facts too. Because after winning 49 of their first 74 games, 24 games above 500 at that point, something only 84 teams, including 2 this year, the Orioles and the Phillies, have ever accomplished in Major League history. High point of the season. Went 42-46 the rest of the way, going down from a 116 win pace over the first half to a 77 win pace the following half. They were a bad team for 3 months. And frankly, not even a particularly interesting bad team, just kind of a mediocre bad team. The kind that I spent what feels like my entire life watching. And while that is a 77 win pace and it is disappointing, the most disappointing part were the 2 playoff losses that followed that. As implied by the fact, the Orioles have not made consecutive playoffs since 1997. There's some baggage there. And that comes from a lack of sustained success by that. Now, this team, these players specifically, they have some baggage from last year. They had some quote-unquote unfinished business. But otherwise, what this year has had me thinking about, particularly now in the wake of it ending, is a kind of unfair aspect of sports in which we, the fans, are really the ones who carry the baggage. That does not linger with the people on the field. That is something that we have had inflicted upon us, to be a little dramatic, and we now project onto those people on the field. And it's not entirely fair at all, but that is the reality. It isn't Adley Rutschman's fault that Matt Wieters didn't show up in the playoffs. It's not Brandon Hyde's fault that Buck Showalter sent in Ubaldo Jimenez and left Zach Britton in the bullpen. It's not anyone's fault that Raul fucking Ibanez hit home runs in consecutive at-bats against Jim Johnson. None of these Orioles are responsible for what the Orioles have done before. I should mention, all of this is still Salvador Perez's fault to some extent. But the thing is that when all of those teams lost, it did not represent some first step towards eventual success. These were all largely blips, and it was all largely the same thing pretty much every time. Whenever the Orioles lose, it feels as though it is the Orioles just running out of steam. It's the Orioles not having enough compared to their opponents, and that's not fair to the players. But there's another related thought that I had recently when I came across a Teddy Roosevelt quote. This was in an article about University of Connecticut's upcoming season. This apparently hangs in the University of Connecticut athletics office. Far better it is to do mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with these poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much because they live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. It's a little dramatic, it's a little wordy, it doesn't have the brevity of TR's Speak Softly and Carry a Big Stick, but what I think that illustrates is there is an extent to which the unfairness goes both ways. Yes, these players live with demons that we've taken in, and that they are forced, for a lot of money, but still forced to deal with. And we put all of our faith in these guys, and I will say that in the past 3 years of having a quote-unquote good baseball team, TR is correct. It is indeed far better to do mighty things while risking failure rather than to live in that murky twilight. But unfortunately, the ultimate success or failure comes down to those people that we put these feelings in. And so the history comes from us, but in order to move past it, the responsibility falls on these guys. We are simply witnesses to their attempts to do away the demons that we carry with us. And as I am wont to do, it has me thinking about the city that the Baltimore Orioles represent. Baltimore has not had the best past few decades. In 1968, there were a lot of riots here following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that really marked a turning point for the city. At that point, businesses started leaving, manufacturing started leaving, residents started leaving. Initially, a lot of white ones going to the counties, but people from every demographic now continue to flee the city at massive numbers. We've had 2 mayors have to resign due to corruption. We had a president, even if it was the one that's an absolute motherfucker, just go out on national television, call us a rat-infested shithole. We had our fucking bridge get destroyed this year. This has not been a good time for Baltimore. And it also feels like this city, which in the 1960s was still in the top 10 by population, and has gone down by a couple 100,000 just in my lifetime. Much like the Orioles, it feels as though it simply doesn't have enough. I mean, that goes for the Ravens too, to some extent. Like, it should be noted, both Baltimore teams have recently had a tendency to struggle with lower-seeded Midwesterners at home. Ravens at this point have lost to Indianapolis, twice to Tennessee, and most recently to Kansas City, all at home, in addition to the Orioles also losing now 10 straight playoff games, 8 of them at home. It's enough for someone who is not just from the area, but from Baltimore itself, to take it a little personally, to feel like there is some kind of higher power trying to hit you upside the head with a metaphor. Like a day job, as I've mentioned before, I work in a museum, charts and tries to preserve this history of an industrial Baltimore that existed once upon a time. The necessary corollary of that being that, oh shit, this doesn't exist anymore, so why don't I sit here in this testament to the decline of this city since the 1980s. It's all a little over obvious at times. I never thought I would be one of the fans that would be upset about a 90-win season. I mean, this is the 6th best season I've ever seen, just by wins. I never thought, going back to football for a moment, I'd be the kind of fan that's dissatisfied with a team led by a 2-time MVP quarterback. And again, deep down, I know that I had fun this year at the ballpark at times. In our most recent regular episode, the one that came out today, I talked about how much fun I just had at a Ravens-Bills game. Like, I can enjoy sports in Baltimore, but man, these last 2 Orioles games against KC, it wasn't even just the span of the games. Before, during, and after, it simply was not fun. Going back to that Ravens-Bills game, I talked about how my relationship with the Ravens is really, my relationship with my dad. All sports are more than what they actually are. And I've been thinking a lot about my relationship with my parents and with sports. And that's because, my wife and I would love to be parents someday. It is something that we are thinking about very much in the present tense. And given how tied to my family my sports fandom has always been, I have, thought about what I would be passing on as a sports fan to a potential child. Like, do I want to foist this, I'm not going to say suffering, but you know what I mean. Am I really going to put that on a kid? I have had a lot of struggles in my life with clinical depression. Doing better now. Hey, that's great. And it's probably a little bit of a chicken or the egg thing as to whether depression is because of how I take in sports or whether it is the reason why I take in sports the way that I do. But whatever one came first, the combination of the two has led me to tend to expect the worst outcome in big moments for my teams. And the unfortunate thing is very, very often, all of my teams, but especially the Baltimore Orioles, have delivered the worst possible outcome in those big moments. Now, I've made a certain peace with this part of my life. I wish that I did not care this much, to be completely honest. That is what I have thought over and over again in the roughly 36 hours since the season ended. I wish that I could shut this part of me off, but I simply can't. And that's okay. But the implication of what it would be like to subject a child to this has bothered me to some extent. And something I want to clarify real quick, my mom, the Baltimore native of my parents, is the one who instilled the Orioles with me, and I hold no ill will towards her. There's no blaming of her. Like, how could she know? The Orioles had won 3 World Series during her lifetime. But that was over 40 years ago. They've won 3 playoff series since then. If you want to be really generous and give them the wild card round in 2012, okay, 4, because of 1 game. And plenty of people around the area say, oh yeah, but hey, 40 years just means we're due. And to that, I typically reply that I'm sure many Cubs fans thought that in 1948, 4 decades after their most recent World Series. And we know how much longer they waited. So this has been on my mind these past 16 weeks during that 42 and 46 stretch, not including those most important final 2 losses, as the Orioles slowly just crumbled. Now, dear listener, you've made it this far into my little therapy session. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Don't go putting this on blast. We don't need to let everyone in the world know this. This is between you and me, because you're here with me now. This concern is not in the abstract. This concern about what fandom I will potentially pass on to a child, because my wife and I are expecting a child right now. We're going to say that with all caution. Many things can go wrong. Just because you're expecting a child doesn't mean you will have one necessarily. But right now, she is legitimately pregnant. This is not a joke. And so all of this has been a very real concern. And that's especially for one reason that, again, I need to clarify, is not a joke. My wife is about 16 weeks pregnant, which means, in fact, if the doctor is to be believed, our potential child's date of conception goes back to June 20th, the day in which the Orioles were the most games above 500 they would be all season before embarking on this 42-46 stretch. And listener, at the risk of being a little too blue, I can guarantee you that such conception would have taken place after the ball game that day. They perfectly coincide, this stretch of futility and this pregnancy. And I think you can imagine that that probably just makes it a little bit extra agonizing. And that has made this last week hurt thousands of times more than any of the previous playoff losses for years. It has just been truly devastating. And knowing this and feeling this, the question has become, how could I make any other person feel this way, let alone my potential child? Like I said, it's been about 36 hours now since the season ended, and I have felt many things. I've thought about the daggers of this year and the daggers of 2004 and 2012 and 2014 and 2016 and last year and again this year and again this year and again this year. And beyond that, beyond those like daggers, those stabbing, horrible moments, I felt just the dull, permanent throb of the playoffless streaks of 15 years from 98 to 2011, or the god-awful Mike Elias tank era to begin all of this. And that brings us just right back to this thought that, fair or not, players have to carry the baggage that the fans have. Every team, every season carries the baggage of all of the ones that have come before it for us. We're stuck around. We don't get to go into free agency. We don't get traded to other organizations. We don't get designated for assignment. We're stuck with the feelings this team has left us with before, and the teams that we're watching now can't escape that. I have remembered some other games, though, too. I remembered the 2011 Reimold and Andino walk-off against the Sox. I've remembered the 2014 ALDS, the Delman Young double, the last home game that the Orioles have won still at this point in the playoffs. I remembered Clinchmas last year. I remembered these transcendent moments, these moments of just absolute uncontrollable joy. But, I mean, I also have remembered a lot of other season-ending wins that didn't matter, except that we won that day. I remember going up against the Blue Jays in a meaningless 2010 final win. And I remember, middle of the season wins, meaningless interleague games against the Brewers or the Rockies. And I remember plenty of other losses that might have sucked, but I got to spend them enjoying a game with someone or some people that I enjoyed being around. I think, particularly for those of us that live in the very literal cities that the teams represent, part of the reason that we associate the teams with the cities, it's not just the geographic obviousness that they are there. It is where they live. But I think it's because both our cities and our sports teams, they are two aspects of the most fundamentally human things to me. Most fundamentally human desires and inclinations, however you want to call them, the things that make us human. This desire to both form community and this desire to share stories. All this show has ever been about, all sports have ever been about, all that, as far as I'm concerned, humanity has ever been about, is people getting together to survive, and then people sharing stories to make survival worth it. And when you put it that way, the question becomes, how could I deprive any person, let alone my potential child, from what sports could give them? And hey, maybe they won't care. Maybe this will be an easy decision for me because they just won't be into it. That's fine too. But they are going to have a pretty good chance at the start, at the very least, because the 16-week pregnancy, it means two things. Once again, it means that, hilariously, I seem to have, through certain carnal acts, cursed the Baltimore Orioles, and I do apologize for that. Any Baltimore fans listening, sorry, didn't know that was going to happen. But it does mean one other thing. And I, again, have to express this is not a joke. I am not shitting you. If doctors are correct, our current expected due date perfectly coincides with the opening week of the 2025 season. So if that holds, that will certainly distract me somewhat from the birds, but not entirely. And it will mean that next season represents a lot of things, and we can't know what next season holds right now. We can look back on 2024 and focus on the positive and acknowledge that it ended about as badly as it possibly could have. In taking this time to sit with feelings in the immediate aftermath of a gutting loss, I have done my best to find peace, and I have done my best to think about what it is that I want to share going forward. And I don't have the answer yet necessarily. I probably won't until next year. We'll see what happens. But until then, we simply will just have to wait and see what the future holds. So, thank you for listening to my self-therapizing. Thank you for hopefully listening to this week's episode as well. You should listen to this week's episode. You should listen to every single episode, frankly. You can find everything after all at bit.ly/rememberthatguy, all one word, all lowercase. Till next week, I have been one of your hosts, James. And as Diaz would say if he was joining me right now, Guy Birds.